weapons. Tragedy and Hope: A History of the World in Our Time by Carroll Quigley. Chapter 17: Nuclear Rivalry and the Cold War. American Atomic Supremacy, 1945 to 1950. The Factors. Historically, the period 1945 to early 1963 forms a unity. During this period, a number of factors interacted upon one another to present a very complicated and extraordinarily dangerous series of events. That mankind and civilized life got through the period of almost 2 decades may be attributed to a number of lucky chances, rather than to any particular skill among the two opposing political blocs or among the neutrals. The period as a whole is so complex that no successful effort has been made by any historian to present it as a unity. Instead, it is usually treated as a series of separate, relatively isolated developments, such as events in the Far East, United States domestic history, Soviet domestic history, developments in science and technology, the rise of the neutrals, and other developments. Such a presentation is not adequate, because it falsifies the historical fact that these and other developments occurred simultaneously and constantly reacted upon one another. Moreover, the central fact of the whole period, and the one which dominated all the others, was the scientific and technological rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. Because this rivalry formed the very foundation and core of the Cold War, which was recognized by everyone to be the dominant political factor of the period. Unfortunately, the Cold War is almost always described in terms which put minor emphasis on, or which may even neglect, the role of Soviet-American technological rivalry. This is done because most historians do not feel competent to discuss it, but chiefly it is done because much of the evidence is secret. Because of such secrecy, the story of this Soviet-American technological rivalry falls into 2 quite distinct and even contradictory parts. 1. What the real situation was, and 2. What prevalent public opinion believed the situation to be. For example, in 1954 to 1955, the Soviet Union had a thermonuclear so-called H-bomb, many months before we did, when public opinion believed the opposite. Again, in late 1960, there was a widespread belief throughout the world in a so-called missile gap, or American inferiority in nuclear missile weapons, when no such inferiority existed. And finally, for a period of several years, from 1957 to about 1960, the Russians were in advance of the United States and the free world generally in missile technology and in missile guidance mechanisms, although this was not reflected, then or later, in any superiority in nuclear missile weapons, because of their simultaneous inferiority in nuclear warheads for missiles, and inferiority by a wide margin both in numbers and in variety of such explosive weapons. In dealing with this central factor of the world situation, the historian is prevented by secrecy on both sides from making any assured or final judgments, and must simply make a judicious estimate of the situation on the basis of available information. Unfortunately, the influence of this factor is so central, and thus so all-pervasive, that inability to be sure of the facts on this matter brings a fair amount of uncertainty into many other areas, such as, for example, the foreign policy of John Foster Dulles, or the real significance of the so-called atomic espionage cases. Such uncertainty, however, is always present in historical analysis of the recent past, and most historians, knowing that the documents, and thus the facts, are unavailable for contemporary history, say, the last 20 years, usually leave the most recent past to others, to political scientists, journalists, or biographers. In the history of the period 1945 to 1963, there are 6 chief factors. 1. The Cold War and the nuclear balance. 2. Demobilization and remobilization, with special emphasis on the inter-service rivalries and the pressures from industrial complexes. 3. Partisan political struggles in the United States, centering on the rise and decline of unilateralism. 4. Personal political struggles in the Soviet Union, centering on the succession to Stalin. 5. Intra-bloc discords, centering on the relations between the United States and its allies on one side, and the relations between the Soviet Union and its satellites on the other side. And 6. The role of neutralism, revolving around backward nationalism and anti-colonialism. The history of the period can be understood only in terms of the interplay of these 6 factors, in all their complexities, treated simultaneously. But before we attempt to do this, we must make a brief examination of each factor separately in order to define our terms and to establish secondary chronological sequences. The Cold War, as we shall see in the next chapter, was an inevitable consequence of the defeats of Germany, Japan, France, and Italy, and the collapse of nationalist China. But it was raised to an acute and sustained crisis by the existence of nuclear weapons and the development of rocket missiles. The combination threatened the survival of man as a civilized being, although it probably did not threaten his continued existence. After a nuclear holocaust, on a degraded social level as a distinct species of living being. The fear of human extermination was spread by many well-intentioned, mistaken, or mercenary people, and reached its peak perhaps in the commercial success of Nevil Shute's On the Beach, both as a novel and as a motion picture. The annihilation of man, as shown in such works, is technically possible, but it will certainly not result from the weapons which would be used in total thermonuclear war. However, there is always a remote possibility that a madman such as Hitler might decide to destroy the human race as revenge for the frustration of his insane ambitions. This could be done in a number of ways, of which the simplest would be to encase a large number of thermonuclear bombs in thick layers of cobalt. The ensuing fallout of radioactive cobalt-60 could extinguish all animal life on Earth, excluding most plants, insects, and other invertebrates. No sane policy would use such a bomb, since cobalt-60 is 320 times as radioactive as radium, and it would require at least 400 such bombs, each at least 1 ton in weight, to release enough radioactivity to extinguish all animal life on Earth. However, even without a cobalt bomb, any extensive nuclear war would kill hundreds of millions of human beings and would release sufficient radioactivity to inflict such extensive genetic damage that subsequent generations of human beings would produce a substantial percentage of monsters. This fact, added to the genetic damage to bird life, might create a situation where men would be unable to compete successfully with insects, who are much more immune to genetic damage from radioactivity. The balance of nuclear weapons is a central factor in the Cold War. Since no agreement on cessation of nuclear testing, nuclear disarmament, conventional disarmament, or relaxation of tension can occur until both sides recognize that a nuclear balance of equilibrium, the so-called nuclear stalemate, has been achieved. This came close to achievement early in 1950, when both sides had atomic weapons, but was destroyed at that time by President Truman's order to proceed with the development of the hydrogen bomb. It was not achieved again until the end of 1962, because when both sides had achieved the H-bomb by 1956, that balance was disturbed by the missile race, which reached its wildest disequilibrium with the Soviet success with Sputnik in October 1957. This led to the subsequent race to obtain an intercontinental ballistic missile, with nuclear warhead, ICBM, in 1957 to 1962. By 1963, when both sides had these weapons, the balance of terror was established and negotiation was possible. As a matter of fact, the balance was not equal, since the American total capability in nuclear war was far superior to that of the Soviet Union in 1963. But weapons development had reached approximately the same point. The United States was more vulnerable to Russia's fewer weapons because a larger part of its population was industrial and urban, and the Soviet Union had growing problems with other areas, notably its alienation from communist China. At the same time, gross fissures began to appear in the Western Bloc, from de Gaulle's effort to turn Europe out of the American camp and into a third, neutralist force. About the same time, the Cuban crisis of October 1962, somewhat like the Fashoda crisis of 1898, by bringing the United States and the Soviet Union to the edge of a war that neither wanted, revealed to both the mutual balance of error and the need to do something about it. All this marked the end of the historical period, which began in 1945. The chief subdivisions of the history of nuclear balance over the period 1945 to 1963 are as follows. 1. The American atomic monopoly from Alamogordo in June 1945 to the first Soviet atom bomb, Joe 1, in August 1949. 2. A brief nuclear balance from 1949 to 1950. 3. The race for the hydrogen bomb from January 1950 through the first American hydrogen fusion at Inaiwitok in November 1952, and the first Soviet H-bomb explosion of August 1953, to the American achievement of a practical thermonuclear weapon in March 1954. This contest continued for 2 more years, as each side tried to perfect the new weapon as an aerial bomb. The United States made its first successful airdrop of a fusion bomb on May 21, 1956, almost certainly later than the comparable Soviet test. 4. The race for the ICBM from 1956 to 1962 had been widely misunderstood because propaganda falsehoods from both sides sought to conceal the true situation and often confuse even themselves. Basically, the problem was, at the beginning, how to combine the American Nagasaki bomb, which weighed 9,000 pounds, with the German V-2 rocket, which carried a warhead of 1,700 pounds, only 200 miles. The Soviet government sought to close the gap between rocket power and nuclear payload by working toward a more powerful rocket, while the Americans, over the opposition of the air forces and the aviation industry, sought to close the gap by getting smaller bombs. The result of the race was the Soviet government acquired a series of very powerful rocket boosters ranging in thrust from 800,000 pounds to 1.5 million pounds, and capable of hurling capsules from 1 to over 7 tons in weight. These were demonstrated to an astonished world from October 1957 onward. These Soviet successes in space made the American effort in rocket boosters look very second-rate, but this impression was rather misleading. It was perfectly true that the United States in 1957 to 1960 had no powerful rocket boosters capable of hurling large space vehicles into orbit or past the moon, as was done with the 3,240-pound Soviet Lunik 1 in January 1959. But the United States, in this period, had a large number of fission and fusion warheads in a great variety of sizes, and was rapidly developing moderately powerful rockets able to carry these great distances. In fact, the first American ICBM was fired from Cape Canaveral in December 1957 2 months after Sputnik 1, and went full range in November 1958. By 1961, the United States had a varied assortment of missiles, both solid and liquid-fueled, some able to be fired in minutes and capable of carrying nuclear warheads, whose explosive power was equivalent to as little as 750,000 tons of TNT. Thus 43 times the force of the Hiroshima A-bomb, to 5 million or more tons of TNT. These could be delivered distances from 1,000 to over 6,000 miles, and with such accuracy that at least half could be landed in a circle within 3 miles of a target. These developments left the Soviet Union with a much smaller number of giant rockets able to carry 20 megaton, or 20 million tons of TNT, warheads, but so large that their locations were soon spied out by American high-flying U-2 photographic planes. To remedy this overemphasis on size, the Soviet Union, in October 1961, broke the moratorium on nuclear explosive testing, which had existed since October 1958, and exploded a great variety of small bombs from 1 to 5 megatons, as well as a gigantic one of 25 megatons, and a colossal one of 58 megatons. The latter, the largest bomb ever exploded, was equal to 1/3 the total of all previous nuclear explosions from 1945 to the end of previous testing in December 1958. Even before these final tests, in 1960, elaborate calculations on the gigantic electronic computers in the Pentagon were estimating the consequences of a hypothetical total nuclear war in June 1963. 2 answers were: 1. If the Soviet Union struck first and the United States retaliated, the war would be over in a single day, with a Russian victory in which they lost 40 million of their 220 million population dead and 40% of their industrial capacity, while America would have 150 million of its 195 million people dead and 60% of its industry destroyed. 2. If the United States struck first with a nuclear attack in reply to a Soviet advance of ground troops into Germany, 75 million Russians and 110 million Americans would be killed. Half the industry of both would be destroyed, and neither could win. On this basis, some relaxation of tension became imperative. As soon as the Soviets could be satisfied they had achieved stalemate by their 1961 to 1962 nuclear tests. Closely related to this 4-stage sequence of nuclear capability is the quite different 4-stage sequence of strategic planning. This is concerned with what we plan to do as distinct from what we are able to do. From the American side, it has 4 stages as follows. 1. Great power cooperation within the United Nations Organization, 1945 to 1946. 2. Containment of Soviet expansion by all means available, including economic aid to others, the Marshall Plan, conventional forces, as in NATO, and nuclear weapons, 1946 to 1953. 3. Liberation, massive retaliation, and the New Look, 1953 to 1960. This period, associated with the influence of Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, sought to deal with foreign crisis by the use of slogans and quite unrealistic policies which could never have been used. Our allies, the neutrals, and even the Russians were ignored and often despised, while the State Department engaged in what Dulles himself called, in January 1956, going to the brink of war. This policy sought to reduce government spending and balance the budget by reducing expenditures for all local or conventional wars, and to base our strategy and our foreign policy on the threat that any Soviet advance of any kind, anywhere, of which we disapproved, would be stopped by our massive retaliation with all-out nuclear attack, anywhere we judged appropriate, on a unilateral, without consultation with our allies, and on a first strike basis. That is, we would do this even if the Soviet Union had not attacked us and had not used nuclear weapons. This policy was hopelessly irresponsible and not only alienated allies such as France and neutrals such as India, but could not be used, since we would never adopt such suicidal and ineffective tactics to reply to a communist local advance in Korea, Southeast Asia, Tibet, Afghanistan, Iran, Egypt, Yugoslavia, or most other places on the periphery of the Soviet bloc. This policy abandoned NATO, in fact, if not in theory, and meant that we had publicly adopted a policy we would never carry out. Because even if we were willing to accept the full consequences of the Soviet nuclear counterblow to our massive retaliation, we could not ever win in such a war, since Soviet ground forces, with their 125 divisions in Europe, could easily overrun NATO's 25 divisions and would occupy all Europe except Britain and Spain. The Kremlin leaders, moving to Paris or Rome, perhaps in the Vatican, would be beyond our reach and could hold London under nuclear threat, while both the United States and the Soviet Union were devastated. The dullest doctrine was not a doctrine of action, but solely a doctrine of threats, since it expected that the threat alone would stop Soviet advances, and that it would never be necessary to carry out the threat. The policy worked, in the sense that the world and the United States lived through it, only because the Soviet Union, at the same time, was in the interregnum between the death of Stalin, March 5, 1942, and the accession to full power of Khrushchev, July 4, 1957, to March 27, 1958. The last 2 years were occupied by the Eisenhower administration's efforts to get back to a more workable defense policy based on a variety of responses to Soviet actions, and to do so without either repudiating Dulles or excessively unbalancing the budget. 4. Graduated Deterrence from 1960 onward was really an effort to get back to the policies of 1950 as advocated by the National Security Council paper NSC 58 of March 1950, and generally to the advice given by Robert Oppenheimer before his public career had been destroyed by the massive retaliation advocates in 1953. This revived doctrine called for a graduated and varied strategic response to Soviet aggression, combined with cooperation with our allies, recognition of the rights of neutrals to be neutral, increased economic and cultural aid to both groups, and relaxation of tension with the Soviet Union by cultural and scientific cooperation. This broad and varied program had at its core development of at least 4 levels of possible war. 1. War with conventional weapons. 2. Addition of tactical nuclear weapons. 3. Strategic nuclear attack on a no-cities basis, with attacks aimed only at Soviet military bases and installations. And 4. The total devastation response. Each of these had subgradations and gave rise to unsolved problems, such as escalation. That is, the possibility that one level would develop gradually into a more intense level in the heat of combat. Moreover, such complex responses required immense outlays of money, even if the achievement of the whole was spread over many years. But this cost, it was felt, would be worthwhile, since nuclear warfare, on a no-cities basis, would save about 100 million American lives in the first week of war, in comparison with war on the total devastation level. One element in this whole strategic shift was the shift of the emphasis of our response from Strategic Air Command, SAC, nuclear bombing, to conventional Army forces, and to the Navy's nuclear submarines with Polaris missiles. The former would reduce the temptation to the Soviet Union to instigate local brush fire wars, while the latter would be even more successful in preventing any Soviet nuclear first strike, since such an attack would be much less able to find and destroy Polaris submarines than it would be to wipe out fixed SAC bases. The next great aspect of post-war history was the partisan political struggles within the United States, centering on the rise and decline of unilateralism and neo-isolationism. As we shall see in a later chapter, the party struggle in the United States took the form of a struggle between the party of the middle classes, the Republicans, and the party of the fringes, the Democrats. This lineup, with its multitude of exceptional cases, found the intellectuals, including the scientists, the internationalists, the minorities, and the cosmopolitans in the Democratic Party, with the businessmen, bankers, and clerks in the Republican Party. The isolationism of the latter, combined with their inability to cope with the world depression or with the international crisis arising from Hitler, kept the Democrats in the White House for 20 years, 1933 to 1953. The defeat of Dewey by Truman in 1948 was a particularly bitter pill, and the Republican partisans, after that event, were ready to adopt any weapon which could be used to discredit the Democratic administration. They found such a weapon ready at hand in the neo-isolationist forces within the Republican Party, which were entrenched in the Congress by the seniority system of committee controls which operated there. Since either party in the United States wins a presidential election on a national and not on a local basis, and by appealing to the moderate middle group, people who are willing to shift their vote and to consider the issues presented, a party which is long out of the White House will be reduced to the control of its local, narrow, ignorant, and extremist core, which is unwilling to consider issues or the national welfare, or to shift their party stand and votes. For these reasons, the Republican Party had fallen into congressional control, represented by Senate figures such as Senators Robert Taft, Kenneth Wherry, Styles Bridges, and William Jenner. Of those who were most ignorant of the real issues and were most remote from any conceptions of national political responsibility. This group, to whom we often give the name neo-isolationist, knew nothing of the world outside the United States, and generally despised it. Thus, they gave no consideration to our allies or neutrals, and saw no reason to know or to study Russia, since it could be hated completely without need for accurate knowledge. All foreigners were regarded as unprincipled, weak, poor, ignorant, and evil, with only one aim in life, namely, to prey on the United States. These neo-isolationists and unilateralists were equally filled with suspicion or a hatred of any American intellectuals, including scientists, because they had no conception of any man who placed objective truth higher than subjective interests, since such an attitude was a complete challenge to the American businessman's assumption that all men are and should be concerned with the pursuit of self-interest and profit. At the end of the war, it was but natural that many Americans should seek to return from foreign and incomprehensible matters including countries, peoples, and problems, which were a standing refutation to the American neo-isolationists' ideas of human nature, of social structure, and of proper motivations. Neo-isolationism had a series of assumptions which explained their statements and actions, and which could not possibly be held by anyone who had any knowledge of the world outside American lower-middle-class business circles. These beliefs were at least 7 in number. 1. Unilateralism. The belief that the United States should and could act by itself without need to consider allies, neutrals, or the Soviet Union. 2. National omnipotence. The belief that the United States is so rich and powerful that no one else counts, and that there is, accordingly, no need to study foreign areas, customs, or policies, since America's policies can be based exclusively on its own power and its own high moral principles, which have no real meaning to anyone else. 3. Unlimited goals, or utopianism. The belief that there are final solutions to the world's problems. This assumes that American power permits it to do what it wishes, and that demonstration of this power to trouble-making foreigners will make them leave the United States alone and secure forever. This idea was reflected in its crudest form, in the belief that America's power could be applied to the world in one final smash, after which everything would be settled forever. Upholders of this view refused to accept that America's security in the 19th century had been an untypical and temporary condition, and that constant danger and constant problems were a perpetual condition of human life, except in brief and unusual circumstances. This kind of impatience with foreign problems and danger was clearly stated by Dulles in his article, A Policy of Boldness, in Life magazine, May 19, 1952. There he insisted that the Truman policy of containment must be replaced by a policy of liberation, since the former was based on treadmill policies which at best might perhaps keep us in the same place until we drop exhausted. These policies, he argued, would lead to financial collapse and loss of civil liberties, were not designed to win the victory conclusively, and did not seek to solve the problem of the Soviet Union, but to live with it, presumably forever. His solution was to refuse to recognize communist control either in the European satellites or in China, to deny the existence of the Iron Curtain, and to free millions enslaved by communism. Although the only way these millions could be freed was by war, Dulles refused to advocate preventative war, and established no method of achieving his goals except his belief that if he refused to face reality, reality would change. However, he did accept preventative war in the form of massive retaliation if the communists made any further advances, and he established the argument that the Truman policy of containing the communists was a policy of refusing to defeat them, from softness or fear or sympathy. This became the basis for future partisan Republican charges that Democratic administrations were soft on communism and pursued no-win policies. 4. The neo-isolationist belief in American omnipotence and foreign inferiority led, almost at once, to the conclusion that continuance of the Soviet threat arose from internal treason within America, and that the Russian nuclear successes must be based on treason and espionage, and could not possibly be based on foreign science or Soviet industrial capability. The neo-isolationists were convinced that the only threat to America came from internal subversion, from communist sympathizers and fellow travelers, since no foreign threat could harm our omnipotence. All opposition to neo-isolationist views was branded as un-American and was traced to low motivations or corruption of American life by such non-American innovations as economic planning, social welfare, or concern for foreigners. Henry Wallace and Mrs. Roosevelt, who were the special targets of these isolationists, were accused of conspiring to give away America's wealth in order to weaken it. A quart of milk to every Hottentot. 5. Since the chief high moral principle which motivated the neo-isolationists was their own economic self-interest, they were especially agitated by high taxes and insisted that Soviet Russia and the Democrats were engaged in a joint tacit conspiracy to destroy America by high taxes, by using Cold War crisis to tax America into bankruptcy. 6. Since the neo-isolationists rejected all partial solutions or limited goals, and were unwilling to pay to increase America's military power, since they insisted it was already overwhelmingly powerful, there was little they could do in foreign affairs except to talk loudly and sign anti-communist pacts and manifestos. This explains Dulles' verbal bluster and missile rattling, and his pactomania, which kept him running about the world signing documents which bound people to pursue anti-communist policies. 7. The unrealistic and unhistoric nature of neo-isolationism meant that it could not actually be pursued as a policy. It was pursued by John Foster Dulles, with permanent injury to our allies, the neutrals, and the personnel of American government. But it was not followed in the Pentagon, and was followed only half-heartedly by Eisenhower in the White House. The president sought to keep the moderate middle group of voters in his camp by radiating his personal charm around the country. But the Pentagon refused to follow Dulles' tactics of appeasing the neo-isolationists by refusing to defend their departmental employees. When Senator McCarthy turned his extravagant charges of subversion and treason from the State Department to the Army, the employees of the latter were defended by Secretary Robert Stevens, and McCarthy's downfall began. The neo-isolationist forces, although defeated at the ballot box in 1960 and 1962, still continue in an increasingly irresponsible form under a variety of names, including John Birch Society members, or more generally, as the radical right. Much less obvious to the public eye than neo-isolationism, but equally influential in creating the history of 1945 to 1963, was the struggle within the American Defense Services as to what use would be made of the nuclear weapon. In 1945, the atom bomb, at once hailed as the absolute weapon against which there was no defense. If true, this would have meant the end of the Army and Navy, since the existing bomb, shaped like a hen's egg, 10 feet 8 inches long, 5 feet in diameter, and weighing 10,000 pounds, could be handled in the B-29 only by modifying its bomb drop to widen the opening, and could not be handled by the ground forces or by Navy guns or carrier planes. Moreover, the range and intensity of its destruction gave rise to immediate claims from the advocates of air power that massed ground forces, slow-moving armored equipment, and all naval vessels, especially the expensive carriers and capital ships, were made obsolete by the new weapon. These extravagant claims were made more critical in their impact by the strategic bombing surveys of World War II and the demobilization problems at the war's end. The advocates of air power from at least 1908 had made extravagant claims, usually based on future rather than on presently available equipment, that the airplane provided the final supreme weapon which made all other methods of warfare unnecessary. This was seen in the arguments of General Giulio Due of Italy, General Billy Mitchell of the United States, and the refugee Russian airplane designer Alexander de Seversky. Due, as early as 1921, preached that the next war would be ended in the first 24 hours by the total destruction of all enemy cities from the air. Mitchell, in the mid-1920s, raised a great furor with his claims that the land-based planes had made battleships and lesser naval vessels obsolete. And Seversky, before, during, and after World War II, claimed that air power had made other arms needless. We have seen how these claims had a considerable and pernicious influence on men's actions before and during World War II. Many airmen who did not believe these claims nevertheless felt they had to support them in order to obtain a large scale of their country's defense funds from civilian politicians who were in no position to judge the merits of such claims. The experience of World War II did not, at first glance, support the claims of the advocates of air power. On November 3, 1944, the United States Secretary of War, on order of the President, set up a committee of 12 to conduct a strategic bombing survey to examine the contribution of strategic bombing to final victory by evaluating bomb damage, assessing captured German and Japanese documents, and interviewing the leaders of the defeated countries. The German survey, which came out in 208 parts over several years, beginning in 1945, did not on the whole support the claims of the air enthusiasts, but rather showed that the Air Force contribution was much less than had been anticipated or hoped, and had become substantial, chiefly in transportation and in gasoline supplies, only after October 1944, when Germany was already beaten, with tactical Air Force help, on the ground. These conclusions were very unwelcome to the Army Air Force officers devoted to strategic bombing, and especially to the airplane manufacturing industry, which had reached the multi-billion-dollar size and hoped to retain at least some of its market after the war's end. In the last few months of the war against Japan, at least $400 million worth of Boeing B-29s and parts were in action in the Pacific. Loss of faith in strategic bombing would expose Air Force officers and the Air Force industry to a grim and poverty-stricken post-war world. Accordingly, it became necessary to both groups to persuade the country that Japan had been defeated by strategic air power. The Strategic Bombing Survey of Japan did not support this contention, although by concentrating on strategic bombing, it helped to cover up the vital role played by submarines in the destruction of the Japanese merchant marine, the equally vital role played by the early Marine Corps' work in amphibious warfare, and above all in the magnificent job done by naval supply forces for all arms, including the strategic bombing bases themselves. The protection and supply of these bases in the Marianas was in sharp contrast with the loss of B-29 bases in continental China to Japanese ground forces, and showed to any unbiased outsider the need for a balanced distribution of all arms in any effective defense system. In such a balanced system, the role of strategic bombing and of large long-range planes, in general, as contrasted with tactical planes and fighters, would obviously be less than either the Air Force officers or the airplane industrialists considered satisfactory. Accordingly, it became urgent for these two groups and their supporters to convince the country, 1. That the atom bomb was not just another weapon, but was the final absolute weapon. 2. That the atom bomb had been the decisive factor in the Japanese surrender, and 3. That nuclear weapons were fitted only for Air Force use and could not be, or should not be, adapted for naval or ground force use. The first 2 of these points were fairly well established in American public opinion in 1945 to 1947, but the third, because of atomic secrecy, had largely to be argued out behind the scenes. All 3 points were largely untrue, or true only if hedged about with reservations which would largely destroy their value as Air Force propaganda. But those who used them were defending interests, not truth, even when they insisted that the interests they were defending were those of the United States and not merely those of the Air Force. In this controversy, the scientists, most of whom were naively defending truth, were bound to be crushed. On the other hand, any dissident scientist could obtain access to money and support by making an alliance with the Air Force. At the center of this problem was the struggle for control of nuclear reactions within the United States, but the ultimate objective of the struggle was the right to exercise influence on the subdividing of the national defense budget. Thus, the struggle centered on the personnel of the Atomic Energy Commission, AEC, and especially of its scientific advisory panel of outstanding scientists, and especially the so-called General Advisory Committee, GAC, of the Atomic Energy Commission. And at the center of the whole struggle was Robert Oppenheimer. Robert Oppenheimer, wartime director of the Los Alamos laboratory, which made the A-bombs, was not a great scientist of the class including Einstein, Bohr, or Fermi, but his knowledge of the subject was profound and wider than most. He was very well educated in cultural matters, especially literature and music, and could quote Homer in Greek and the Bhagavad Gita in Sanskrit at appropriate occasions. His social and, to a greater extent, his political education did not begin until about 1935, when he was 31 and already a full professor at California Institute of Technology and at the University of California. His political naivete continued until after the war. He had always been a persuasive talker, got along very well with a wide diversity of people, and during the war, he discovered he was an excellent administrator. By 1947, he was the chief scientific advisor to most of the important agencies of the government, informally, if not formally, since other scientists frequently consulted with him before giving their decisions on problems. From 1947 on, he was chairman of the GAC, as well as a member of the Atomic Energy Committee of the Defense Department's Research and Development Board, of the National Science Foundation, of the President's Scientific Advisory Board, chairman of the Board of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, and consultant on atomic energy to the CIA, to the State Department, to the National Security Council, to the American Delegation to the United Nations, and to the Joint Congressional Committee on Atomic Energy, the congressional watchdog over the AEC. In all, he was on a total of 35 government committees. In spite of Oppenheimer's exalted positions in 1947 to 1953, which included the directorship of the Great Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, American copy of All Souls College at Oxford, there was a shadow on Oppenheimer's past. In his younger and more naive days, he had been closely associated with communists. Certainly, never a communist himself, and never at any time disloyal to the United States, he had, nonetheless, had long associations with communists. Partly, this arose from his political inexperience, partly from the prevalence of communists among the intellectual circles of the San Francisco Bay region, where he spent the years 1929 to 1942 as a professor and partly from his sudden and belated realization of the terrible tragedy of the World Depression and of Hitler about 1936. At any rate, his brother, Frank Oppenheimer, and the latter's wife were Communist Party workers in San Francisco, at least from 1937 to 1941, while Oppenheimer's own wife, whom he married in 1940, was an ex-communist, widow of a communist who had been killed fighting fascism in Spain, 1937. The Oppenheimers continued to have friends who were communists, and Oppenheimer contributed money until the end of 1941 through communist channels to Spanish refugee relief and to aid for migratory farm workers in California. As late as 1943, he had some kind of remote emotional relationship with a girl, daughter of a fellow professor, who was a communist. All of this derogatory information was known to General Groves and to Army Intelligence, G2, before Oppenheimer was made head of Los Alamos in 1942. The appointment was made because his talents were urgently needed, and there was no reason to feel that he was a communist himself, or that he had ever been, or would ever be, disloyal to the United States. For the next 4 years, Oppenheimer was kept under constant surveillance by M2. His conversations secretly recorded, telephone calls and letters monitored, and all his movements shadowed. In 1954, under oath, General Groves testified to his belief in Oppenheimer's discretion and loyalty, and he repeated this in his memoirs, published in 1962. The significance of all this is that this ancient evidence, plus Oppenheimer's alleged opposition to efforts to make the H-bomb in 1946 to 1949, was used by the advocates of air power, the neo-isolationists, the exponents of massive retaliation, and the professional anti-communists in 1953 to 1954 to destroy Oppenheimer's public reputation, to end his opportunity for continued public service, and to discredit the preceding Democratic administration in Washington. It was an essential element in the massive retaliation, neo-isolationist, McCarthyite, Dulles interregnum of 1953 to 1957, which ran almost exactly parallel to the post-Stalin interregnum in the Soviet Union during the same years. The last significant factor in this post-war period of 18 years was provided by the events in the Far East. In this factor, also, there are 3 sub-periods, of which the most significant was the middle one, from the loss of China to the Communists late in 1949 to the Geneva Summit Conference of July 1955. In this period, the Far East was in confusion over the Chinese victory in mainland China, the outbreak of war in Korea in June 1950, the Korean Armistice of July 1953, the Indo-Chinese War and Armistice in 1953 to 1954, and the threatened Chinese Communist attack on Quemoy, if not on Formosa, in the winter of 1954 to 1955. The earlier period of Far Eastern history saw the slow decay of the nationalist Chinese regime of Chiang Kai-shek and the revival of Japan, while the later, third period centered upon the growing strength and dangerous pugnacity of Red China. This third period ended with the Chinese attack on India in October 1962 and the breakdown between Communist China and the Soviet Union at the end of 1962. The interweaving of these 6 factors makes up a major part of the history of the period 1945 to 1963. In each case, we can discern 3 stages, of which the middle one is the most critical. The dates of these stages are not, of course, the same for all 6 factors, but they are close enough so that the whole 18 years can be examined successfully as 3 consecutive sub-periods organized around the central core of the nuclear rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. Accordingly, We can examine this whole period in the three stages. 1. American atomic supremacy, 1945 to 1950. 2. The race for the H-bomb, 1950 to 1957. And 3. The race for the intercontinental ballistic missile, ICBM. From 1957 to early 1963.